And can someone tell me what the major grievance the Americans had in engaging with the British in the War of 1812? What was their major problem?
Their sailors were being impressed into British service.
Yeah, that's exactly right. American sailors were being impressed into the British Army, and this made Americans very, very angry. Now, of course, we've already mentioned that the British had reversed impressments before the United States attacked, or declared war, that is, and then Americans declared war, and we find out later that the impressment thing has been reversed, and we're like, well, we declared war, so let's go attack Canada. So we did. We invaded Canada. Does anyone know where we invaded into Canada? Like, did we march up and invade through like Massachusetts or Pennsylvania? Like, where was our launching point, our jumping off point into Canada? I believe it was actually through Michigan. So it was like through the Midwest. And you might say, well, why wouldn't the Americans to invade Canada? Why wouldn't they go through like the developed part of the United States, like Pennsylvania, or go up through Massachusetts and hop across there, right? That would make some degree of sense that they would choose to do that, but they didn't. We'll talk about why in just a little bit. So the U.S. attacks Canada, and what do we do in Canada? Oh, by the way, most militiamen wouldn't cross the line, and so we had a little army that marched up there. What did we do there? We burned down their parliament buildings at York. Good times, right? We burned down the parliament buildings. Take that, British. We burned down the parliament buildings. And then, of course, when the British beat back Napoleon, what did the British decide to do next? They decide they're going to come put America in its place. Ah, sorry. Let's look at the course of the war here, and then we'll go back to the previous slide. So you might be jumping around just a little bit. After the British defeat the French, they turn their attention to the United States, and they attack the East Coast and do some random invading and whatever along the coast, and then they launch an attack on Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is burned to the ground. How did the Americans do it defending the city? Well, it's an embarrassment. You'd like to say that there was a battle for American defense of our capital, but it's not known as that. Does anyone know what it's called? It's called the Bladensburg, not battle, but the Bladensburg races. The Americans lined up, and when they saw the British coming, they fought for just a little bit. The Americans turned around and ran. They ran so fast that many of the British suffered heat stroke trying to keep up with them. That's why it was known as the races, because the Americans ran away. It was just a total embarrassment. And there Washington sits completely undefended, like nothing. James Madison literally is hiding in the bushes. The president of the United States is hiding in the bushes outside of Washington. He hops on his horse and he's eventually running around trying to rally troops. Just crazy. And then the British they go into our Capitol building, and they all sit. The soldiers sit down in the desks, and then you guys might enjoy British humor. They vote unanimously to burn the building. They pretended to. They all sat down and they're like, I make a motion that we burn this building. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Burn it to the ground. And they did. They burned it to the ground. Yeah, talk about an embarrassment. Now, keep in mind that this is happening in our capital. And we got involved in this war. Washington had a better reason to fight the British. Adams had a better reason to fight the French. Jefferson had a better reason to fight the British. And it's Madison who gets us into this. So I guess you get what you get. And you don't throw a fit. Well, the Americans did. The British, does anyone know what happens after they set the whole town on fire? A massive hurricane shows up and beats the snot out of the British and beats them up so badly that they kind of limp back. Yeah, seriously, a hurricane with a tornado in the middle of it touches down in the middle of Washington as the British are trying to burn it to the ground. You can't make this up. Like this literally happens. And the tornado was so strong that it was lifting the pieces of the cannon and shuffling it around on the ground. The British were throwing themselves behind like these leftover smoldering walls to try to keep themselves from being like thrown around and sucked up in the tornado. Craziness. So the British hop back on their boats, and then they go and they attack where next? They go to Baltimore, and in Baltimore, there's a very important fort. Does anyone know the name of the fort that guards the entrance to the harbor of Baltimore? Fort McHenry is the name of it. And this is most noted today because there was a guy who was trying to get one of his friends captured by the British off of a British ship. And that guy's name is Francis Scott Key. What did Francis Scott Key do?
He wrote the Star-Spangled Banner.
Yeah, he wrote the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner, and that is later attached to the tune "To Anacreon," which was an old British drinking song. And that's our national anthem today. That doesn't become our national anthem though until the 1930s. I think 1932 it becomes our official national anthem. And through most of the 1800s, "Hail Columbia" was a more popular national anthem than the Star-Spangled Banner, but that eventually fades away in terms of popularity, and the national anthem is eventually embraced, Star-Spangled Banner. Are the British successful at burning down Baltimore too? Someone tell me. You guys have any idea?
No, they weren't.
Yeah, that's correct. They were not. The Americans, and normally I draw this all out on the board so you can see this how this works, but the entrance to Baltimore Harbor is pretty narrow. The Americans actually sank some of their own ships right there in the entrance to make it difficult for the British to sail past. Meanwhile, Fort McHenry sits right there guarding the entrance, and so you can imagine the British trying to come through and hitting the ships that are sunk on the holes of the British ships, hitting the sunken ships, and then having Fort McHenry fire at you. And so the ships try to take out Fort McHenry from a distance by lobbing artillery at it, and it stands. Meanwhile, there is a ground expedition going to attack Baltimore at the same time, and ultimately the commander that was so successful in Washington, D.C. burning it, he's shot and killed by kind of a random, no one knows who sniped him, but someone sniped the commander. It was very popular with the British, and from there on, the British are a bit leaderless in terms of being able to command respect on the battlefield. So eventually the British all pile back on the ships, and then they go where to next? It's on the screen.
New Orleans.
They go to New Orleans. And New Orleans, of course, is quite a ways away. And does anyone know who becomes the leader of the American defense in New Orleans? He's a guy from the great state of Tennessee.
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson. If I had to, well, I'm not going to compare modern politicians to people, but Andrew Jackson is an atypical politician who does crazy stuff that sometimes surprisingly works. So Andrew Jackson, he goes down to New Orleans, hearing that the British are going to attack there, and he puts together the most motley, weird group of American defenders. He takes his little militia. He involves other militias in the area. He recruits from the town of New Orleans. He recruits freed blacks to help fight as well. He recruits French people in New Orleans to help fight as well. He even recruits a bunch of pirates to help fight for the Americans in New Orleans. And so you've got this weird group of people defending New Orleans. Now, of course, the British see this as a way to really hurt the Americans. If they can capture New Orleans, then what do the British have control over? Somebody tell me. Why is New Orleans so essential?
The Mississippi River.
Yeah, the Mississippi River. If the British control the outlet of the Mississippi River, all those farmers up in the Northwest, at the time it was the Northwest, now they call us the Northwest, but at the time it was the Northwest, all the farmers up the Mississippi River Valley up into Pennsylvania and elsewhere, Ohio, they would not easily be able to get their crops to market out of New Orleans. So New Orleans, even at the time, was a very busy port. If the British hold it, then the Americans are significantly weakened. And so Andrew Jackson, now normally once again what I do is I draw this all on the board. It makes a lot more sense when you can see it. But the British make several major mistakes, and Andrew Jackson makes a pretty intense mistake as well. So imagine with me that I'm drawing this stuff on the board, and I'm not. So you've got the Mississippi River that's flowing down. It's flowing down this way, okay? So there I'm drawing this with my hands. And then we've got a bunch of swamp. And the British discern, they park their boats a ways away, and they hop off, and they come up with a good way to make it back to kind of the highland where they'll be able to attack. And Andrew Jackson knows where this is, and he realizes that there's a good line of defense across, I think it was called the Rodriguez irrigation ditch. And so what he does with this is he hires his guys for a month before the battle takes place to really dig out the irrigation ditch and make it much deeper and wider, as well as providing this large mound of dirt where the Americans can lean over it and shoot anyone who's approaching on the field. So you've got the Mississippi on one side of that, and then on the other side you've got kind of swamp all the way around. And I think it was almost somewhere between a quarter mile or half a mile long was all. So the British Army had to come marching through that in order to make it to New Orleans. And so the British eventually emerge on the high ground and become marching. But the British make two major mistakes. And with their two major mistakes, they end up losing the battle. But that's partially because Andrew Jackson has a huge problem in terms of his own strategy. You got the Mississippi River, Andrew Jackson's line by on the other side of the ditch. And then on the other side, he has his artillery. What's the problem there? He's got the artillery over here on the side of the river. He's got most of his forces over here. There's a problem there. So obviously if your artillery here and you're firing on the British and they're coming this way, that's all fine and dandy. But what happens if the British takes the artillery and they control the artillery? What can they do?
Fire on your forces.
Yeah, fire it right at Andrew Jackson's forces. And that's how it's set up. There's not a whole bunch of people. It's not well guarded. The artillery is not well guarded. And the British, through their reconnaissance, realize what they can do here. And so they come up with what they're going to do. They're going to invade across the river. They're going to have a small detachment go up there, take the artillery, and turn it against Andrew Jackson. At the same time as the Americans' own artillery is being used against them, the British will be marching up the field, and they'll take their ladders that they're bringing with them and throw them across the Rodriguez irrigation canal, climb over the ladders as the fighting is continuing after a bombardment of the Americans by their own artillery, and then be victorious. How many of you think that makes sense? Like, that's a pretty good plan on the British part. Well, it is, but they forget a couple things. First thing they forget when they're marching is the ladders. So when they get up to the edge of the water and the Americans are like right over across the water, shooting right down at them, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. And Jackson told them, don't shoot until you can see the whites of their eyes. And keep in mind that these are like country boys who have been shooting guns their whole lives. And their aim was good. And these were back with the old muskets. But if you've been shooting the same musket since you were 7, you kind of knew how it worked and knew how that gun shot. And so people would aim right above their eyeballs. That was like the eyeballs were what you'd aim at. They found a couple people, by the way, to show you how accurate that the Americans were at shooting. I found a couple of people who had bullet wounds above each eye. That means that the Americans were shooting, 2 different Americans were shooting at the same guy above each eye, bam, at the same time. So that tells you how accurate the Americans were in their aim. Okay, so they forgot the ladders to get across the irrigation ditch. It's like trying to attack a castle and forgetting the ladders. You guys get that, right? How do you get over the walls without a ladder? If you're attacking a castle, you don't. Okay, so that's the first problem. Second problem was the British failed to take into account the flow of the Mississippi. It flowed a lot more than they anticipated. And so they got in their boat, and instead of like going right across the Mississippi and attacking the artillery, the stream pulls them way down because of the flow, the current, and they get off, and the battle was over by the time those guys got even close to the artillery. Whoops and whoops. And so Jackson is absolutely victorious. This is, even to this very day, one of the most lopsided American victories ever. The Gulf War was also a very lopsided victory, and other than that, I got nothing like it. I think there was 27 American casualties and 3,000 dead British people. Like, it was, don't quote me on those numbers, but it was that lopsided. And Andrew Jackson, very interesting. He said that he walked through the battlefield after the battle was over. And of course, not everyone got shot in their head. Obviously the guy that had 2 bullet holes above his eyes, he was dead. Shot in the head twice at the same time. He probably didn't know what hit him. Look, some of those other people got hit in the arms and the legs. And Jackson said, as he walked over the battlefield, it was like the day of judgment and the resurrection. As there were people writhing around and moaning, and they kept reaching up at him and trying to grab his cloak. Said it was like the day of resurrection. So anyway, there you have it. You know what the funniest thing about the whole thing was? It didn't matter. Peace had been signed 2 weeks earlier in Ghent, Belgium. We just didn't know it. Okay, so a couple different things to be said here. In the end, things went back to exactly the same way as they were before. Status quo ante bellum. That's Latin. What does status quo mean? If I say, well, we're going to keep the status quo, what does that mean? How many of you have ever heard the term status quo? Yeah, so it means, I think Holly is talking, but she's coming in and out quite a bit. It means stays the same. Status quo means the same as, and antebellum means ante is before and bellum is war. So same as before the war, status quo antebellum. The Americans and the British went back to the exact same relationship they had before the war as they did after the war. Same thing, firstly. But what did the victory at New Orleans do for the American spirit? What do you think? Yeah, the Americans, with the help of Andrew Jackson, just beat the snot out of the army that just beat Napoleon. This is the first time we've ever beat a European power by ourselves. Guys, we are awesome. You know what I'm saying? Andrew Jackson pounded those British people in the face. Don't worry, Andrew Jackson will do some other pretty incredible things here in just a minute we'll talk about. Okay. So remember how I mentioned before that rather than going through like Pennsylvania or going through, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, rather than doing that to invade Canada, they went like podunk nowhere, Michigan, right? That's where they went in order to get into Canada to invade. Why? Well, as you can probably imagine, if you were to think about it a little bit, so let's just be practical here. While we're fighting the British, are we trading with the British? Yes or no? Are we still trading with our enemies? What area of our country benefited the most from trade with England? New England, right? The Northeast, because that's where our manufacturing was. That's where our shipbuilding was. That's where our shipping was. That's where our fishing was, right? So that's the manufacturing part of our country. And so when the Democratic Republicans, when Madison is like, yeah, let's go fight our evil enemies, the British, people in the North were like, no, they're our friends. Like, that's how we make our livings, right? And so this goes clear back to the embargo. Remember when Jefferson self-embargoed? It didn't hurt Virginia bad. That's where Jefferson was from. It hurt Massachusetts bad. And so this made people very, very unhappy in the North with the leadership. And this helped the Federalist Party to kind of hang on in the North. There were no Federalists in Virginia. There were no Federalists running around in South Carolina or Georgia. Federalists weren't down there. There were like none. They were all Democratic Republicans, but in the North, the Federalist Party was still there. They still liked Great Britain. Now, when the War of 1812 ended legal trade with England, it didn't end there. Madison was so distrustful of the people from New England that when we invaded Canada, we didn't go through New England. We went someplace else, like Podunk Nowhere, where there's very little infrastructure. Additionally, Madison is like, and we're not going to fund your militaries unless you let me control them. Now, of course, Madison funded everybody else's militaries, every other state's military, and let them run their military their own way, but he wouldn't let them. So once again, this is just nasty prejudice on the part of the president. And so the states ultimately refused. They're like, yeah, we are not going to let you run our military for us. We are going to run our military just like all the other states. And then Madison's like, fine, then I'm not going to pay you to run your military. So you have no federal support. At this point, the people in the North, the manufacturing interests, they feel completely abandoned by the government. They feel completely abandoned in their interests. Madison is working for the interests of maybe Virginia, but certainly not for Massachusetts. And so the Federalists get together about 2 months before the victory in New Orleans. This, keep in mind, is after Washington is already burned to the ground. And the Federalists get together and they start discussing, hey, maybe we ought to be our own country. It's very clear that our interests do not coincide with the interests of, New York and Virginia and South Carolina. And so they discuss secession. Immediately after that, Battle of New Orleans. Now all of a sudden these people look like they're losers. They were talking secession, and this is on the verge of America's greatest victory. Additionally, things go back to exactly the way that they were before. And so that means that New England can trade with England again. No problem. Goes right back to the way it was. And so those Federalists who met to discuss secession, now they look like what? What do they look like? They look like traitors, conspiring against the United States of America on the eve of our greatest victory. And so after this, what happens to the Federalist Party? Look, it already took a pretty big hit when Alexander Hamilton got shot and killed by the vice president. Remember those good old days? That was about 10 years before this. Now the Federalist Party is dead. Dead. Like no resurrection dead. The Federalist Party is never coming back to life. And this leads us right into what era? What's the next little era called? It's called the era of
Good feelings.
The era of good feelings, because there's only one political party. The Federalist Party is completely dead. Doesn't matter what part of the country you're from. Everyone's now a Democratic Republican. How many of you think that would be nice, where all of America was on the same page? We only had one party. There were no big political divisions. Wouldn't that be nice? How many of you think the United States is heading towards an era of good feelings? Okay, that was a mean joke. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Not even close. Okay, so we've talked about the Battle of New Orleans. American nationalism grows pretty strongly after the Battle of New Orleans. Now let's talk about the presidency of James Monroe. James Monroe was president for 2 terms. He was from the great state of Virginia, just like Madison was, just like Jefferson was, just like Washington was. The only ones in the first 6 presidents that were not from the great state of Virginia were the Adamses, both from, of course, Massachusetts. 1819, Florida is a problem. Florida in 1819 was owned by the Spanish, and Andrew Jackson was somehow put in charge, I don't know why, of dealing with the fact that the Indians, the Seminole Indians from Florida, were invading the American territory and were attacking American homesteads in Georgia. Andrew Jackson wasn't going to put up with this. Now keep in mind that this is sovereign Spanish territory. So Andrew Jackson, without the declaration of war, without the direction from the President of the United States, without the direction from anyone anywhere in charge, takes his little army and invades sovereign Spanish Florida and starts shooting Indians. Then he captures a few towns controlled by the Spanish, puts their leaders on trial and hangs them. Spaniards. He's hanging the Spaniards. Can you imagine this? I mean, imagine if we had like a general up there at a fort, whatever the fort is up there in Tacoma, at Fort Lewis. Imagine if they're like, well, I'm going to just go invade Canada. Hey, Canadians. Without the president, without Congress, and just be like, you guys are mean, and start hanging people. Like, that's what Jackson did. That's nuts. Talk about an international incident. Here, the United States has used its military to invade a sovereign nation without a declaration of war. What is Monroe going to do? Unfortunately, Monroe has a very, very sharp and will-like Secretary of State. What's his name?
John Quincy Adams.
Yes. John Quincy Adams is brilliant at what he does. He goes over to the Spanish and he's like, so sorry about that. How can we make this better? How about we just buy Florida from you for some like extreme amount of money in order to sort of say we're sorry? And the Spanish are like, okay, we're poor. So that's how we get Florida. Now, what are we going to do with Andrew Jackson? Some people suggested you got to get Jackson out of the United States. The guy is nuts. Why don't you send him as ambassador to Russia? And Thomas Jefferson responds. He sends a note to Monroe. He was still alive at the time. He sends a note to Monroe, and he's like, and I won't say the swear words that he does in the letter, but he's like, he'll breed you a quarrel before he's been there a month. Whatever you do not send Andrew Jackson anywhere. So there you have it. That's how we get Florida in 1819. It becomes part of territory of the United States, and shortly after that, it becomes a state. Missouri Compromise in 1820 is another big one that's very, very questionable. Missouri Compromise, big issue. Remember, we bought all that land from from France, Louisiana Territory. And we had now in the American Constitution a way for these new territories. If there's a certain amount of people in an area, lines can be drawn and they can come in as states. Missouri wants to come in as a state in 1820. Actually, I think it petitions in 1819. It wants to come in as a state. And if that happens, Missouri wants to be a slave state. It's going to throw off the balance of power in the Senate, because at that point, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Now there'll be 12 slave states and 11 free states. Each has 2 senators. That's going to throw off the balance of power. And so in order to compromise, another state is brought in from the north that is a free state. Does anyone know what state that is?
Isn't it Maine?
Yeah, that's right, Maine. So Maine comes in as a free state. Missouri comes in as a slave state, and they draw a line across the territory to solve any problems in the future. So they draw a line across, and at this point, we do not own the land that we eventually get from Mexico. Texas is Mexicans, right? And Mexico owns it. Well, at that point, I think it was Spain, and then right after that, it was Mexico's, because Mexico gets their independence. So Mexico owns Texas. Mexico owns New Mexico, obviously, New Mexico, right? Arizona, California, all that area in there, Utah, half of Colorado, all of that was owned by the Mexican government. So when you draw the Mason-Dixon line on over and you say any land that comes in below this will be slave, any land above this will be free. By the way, if you look at it, Missouri is also above the line, which is kind of remarkable. Then we'll keep a balance of power in the Senate. This is just how it's going to be. And people in the North could stomach this, even though many of them at this point were very much against slavery. Why? Because slavery can't spread very far. Right? We don't own Texas. In fact, I think the only state that could come in at that point was going to be Arkansas. Arkansas could still come in, and then can slavery go anywhere else? Nope. Stop of the spread of slavery. And so many Americans are comfortable with this. However, later, Texas comes into the Union, and Texas already has slavery, so slavery is spreading. And by the way, then when we get the rest of the land from Mexico, guess how far, if you keep drawing that line over, guess how far that goes? Clear to the coast. Means we could have slavery a lot of places. And people who owned slaves wanted that. Why? Just basic economics. If you're treating slaves as a commodity rather than as people, which they did, the value of slaves is dependent upon the market. And the population of the slaves was growing in the United States in the South at this time, to the point where the slave really wasn't worth that much anymore, unless there's a new market to sell slaves in. Does that make sense? And so every time you have a new state come in that has slavery that's legal there, what happens to the value of your slave? If now all of a sudden there's a new market to sell slaves in, does the value of your slave go up or does it go down? It goes way up. So every time a new slave state comes in, the value of your slaves goes up. You see how people who had slaves wanted and had lots of slaves, you can see why they wanted slavery to continue to spread, right? Because the value of your, if you owned 1,000 slaves and they were each worth $500, and then a new slave state comes in and now each slave is worth $700, do you see how that's like a fairly large increase in your capital? See how that makes sense? And so there was a lot of effort by the slaveholders in the South to continue pushing slavery westward. That would be a major, major issue that we'll come back and talk about later. Oh, by the way, and you may feel that this is the case or not, today in the United States, we have a majority of Americans who tend to vote Democrat. And yet, because of the way that we have things set up, it's pretty balanced, right? Like Hillary Clinton won the popular vote last time. Did you know that, right? She won by 2%. And yet, because of the Electoral College, Donald Trump becomes president. California has 2 senators. There are millions and millions of people in California. Wyoming has 600,000 people. They each have 2 senators. See how the small conservative area is maybe overrepresented a little bit? And so there are those in the Democratic Party right now that are arguing for adding Washington, D.C., which votes 93% regularly Democrat, as a state. What will that do? Well, from their perspective, they say it will help balance out the overrepresentation of Republicans in the Senate. So we still have the same struggles today about the balance of power in the Senate as they did back in the 1820s. Good times. All right, guys, it's been a pleasure. Class is out. Be ready for Tyndall chapter 11, 5 questions on that, as well as 10 questions on the lectures from 1776 to where we are right now. And we will see you then, or maybe Mrs. Ness will see you then. We shall see. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you later.
Thank you.